Now I want to talk a little bit of history with you with corn heads. What we have here is one of the original John Deere row units from a corn head they introduced in the early 70s. This corn head was really a benchmark in corn heads industry, in durability, and in quantity they built. This row unit was actually introduced in early 70s and actually continued to be the same up till just 3 years ago when John Deere introduced their new corn head, the 600C series. This row unit ran and ran and ran. I remember we bought a 15-year-old corn head when I first started farming, and we ran this corn head, this type of row unit, through 3 combines before we traded it off, probably a period of over 10 years. Some of the issues of it had an intermeshing roller system that did not allow the stock to move back into the row unit, which created a lot of excessive wear in here. Also, this row unit ran very fast. We had a lot of ear bounce with it, but back then, shelling was not an issue. Corn was wet, hard to combine, so we ran this head fast. Deck plate settings didn't make any difference. These are actually the old bolted style that they were bolted in one position, and we really didn't need to be concerned about deck plate adjustment. That all changed with new varieties and new technology. As good as this row unit was in its day, it really outlived its usefulness. John Deere then, after 35 years of using the same really row unit technology, started to develop a new corn head, the 600C series. Why don't we take a look at that row unit and let's just compare old to new. Here we are with the new John Deere row unit that they run on, the 600C series corn head. Let's just start with some very simple things. Continuing with the open pipe and spring. It was an issue with the old corn head, with the old row unit. It's still an issue with this. An open pipe of spring always fills up with dirt. At the end, before the end of the season, you lose your chain tension. The next thing you notice, of course, they put a much bigger chain. A much bigger chain. Well, anytime you put a bigger chain on a corn head, it's going to do more work. There's going to be a bigger load. What did they do to maybe reinforce that? They did nothing up on top. They continued to have a bushing. Same as the old corn head. To get at this bushing, to replace this bushing, you must remove the shaft out of half of the corn head. You must remove the row unit. You must disassemble the row unit to replace this bushing. Bigger chains do more work. Same bushing. The next thing is, you notice the larger sprocket. Where they used to have a disposable sprocket, a very narrow sprocket, they made it much beefier. But let's look a little closer. What did they put for a bearing? They used a very small bearing. This bearing is actually the same bearing used in the John Deere planter on the press wheels. But in the press wheels, there's actually 2 of them. Here, they just use 1. Again, bigger chains, more work, not enough bearing. Now the next thing to look at is look at the deck plate, or the stripper bars. Notice, still narrow, still very narrow edge, that's more likely to kink and break the stock. Again, only one side moves, which means they are never centered over the roller. The stock is always being pulled down at an angle, which can cause breakage and more trash going through the combine. Hydraulically, all the row units change at the same time, but what happens with all hydraulic deck plates is that you create wear. There's a linkage here, there's a wear point here, and down on the pivot where the hydraulic pushes and pulls on the stripper bar. That wear creates slop. When you have slop, now when you adjust, one row unit moves, the other one maybe doesn't. Let's look at what can happen with hydraulic deck plates. As you go across the field, you need to be changing them according to your stock width, from your good corn to your small corn. But what happens is that button to adjust the hydraulic deck plates is right beside the button that lowers and raises the corn head. Accidents happen. Farmer is looking at the yield monitor, unloading on the go. Maybe he's running late at night and he runs the deck plate too tight. What happens? You get a plugging action here. Farmer stops, maybe reverses the head, opens up the deck plate, clears the slug out. But he might forget to close the deck plate again. What happens now that these hydraulic deck plates can open wide enough to cause not just a couple bushels loss, but some major bushels, 10, 20 bushels an acre, especially with modern varieties that are easy to shell. We can save you yield. Maybe a bushel, maybe two. When there's a mistake with a hydraulic deck plate, we can maybe save you 10 to 20. Now let's take a close look underneath this row unit on the 600C series. John Deere went to a knife-to-knife roller, 8 knives coming close together to each other. In some ways, a knife-to-knife idea is good, but you must give room for the plant to go between the bodies of the rollers and the knives themselves. This knife, pinch, pull, open up, but look, it never opens up more than 5/8 of an inch. That means the stock is always creating a binding action between the two big bodies of the roller. That binding action creates horsepower usage and puts stress back on the main gearbox. This design is actually a high horsepower row unit before we even talk about the chopper. When you're medium or small corn, leaving this much of a gap, that'll work. But with modern day genetics, BT, corn rootworm, we have a much healthier, bigger plant that we strive for to get that big yield that we're after. You might be talking corn stalks with at least a 2-inch base, trying to squeeze through a maximum of 5/8 of an inch, and that's only part of the time. The body of the roller is large. The knives are small. You do not create enough place for the body of the stock to swell out. Next is knife roller speed. Remember, we're talking tip speed. Tip speed, the tip speed determines how fast you pull down the ear of corn. John Deere talks about speeding up the knife roller on this row unit 24-25%. That means the ear is going to come to the deck plate at a higher velocity, which we all know creates more air bounce and more shelling when you get into those dry varieties. The length of the roller is slightly longer. Remember, the Drago is substantially longer and it has more time to bring the plant down slow, so you get hardly any air bounce and dramatically less shelling. Let's take a look at how they decided to chop. Chopper, 2 swinging blades. But notice where the first chance the knife has to chop the stalks. It's just as it enters the knife roller itself. That means just as the row unit is starting to touch the stalk, it is cut off. Yes, their pivot point might be here, but the chopping does not happen across from the pivot point. It happens at the first opportunity for that blade to impact the stock. Remember, this blade is turning at an extremely high speed. So all the chopping is going to be done in the front of the row unit. This can cause a yield problem. When you chop this far forward, especially in down corn, as you're trying to pick up the down corn with the chain or the row unit, and then it's chopped off and separated from the stalk, from the ground, that can cause a yield loss. John Deere runs a separate chopper gearbox on the side of the row unit. The power comes out of the main row unit, goes into this gearbox. It is angled geared down to another gearbox, which changes the angles again and brings the power to the blade. Each time you take an angled gear, you increase the horsepower needs 2%, or you decrease the efficiency of a system by 2%. So if we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more angled gears, we have a minimum of 10% more horsepower to do the same job. Let me summarize this from a chopping standpoint. Remember when I talked to you about Olemac, when they developed a chopping corn head, they said that it was very easy to make a corn head chop stocks. What's challenging is don't risk yield, don't add trash, and use the least amount of horsepower. Those are the things that we harvest by with Drago. This corn head fails in all 3 points.